Australia and the USA. So it's been a hugely successful program that's been running for 10 years, and I'm sure you'll find it fascinating to hear about the new things they found out. So I'll be back again tomorrow to introduce Claire, and that will be the final talk, and hopefully you've enjoyed the whole series. I'll see you tomorrow. Good luck to you.
Great, thank you, Peter. So can you hear me all right with this? And is it actually a little too loud? Shall I? No, this is fine? Okay, all right. So as Peter says, I am an academic now at the FITS through some sort of miraculous stroke of good fortune. I started out here as a postdoc in 2010, so I've been here for 10 years myself this year. And I'll talk to you this morning about the Desert Bird and Climate Change research program that we have running at the Fitzpatrick Institute, which we run mostly in collaboration with the University of Pretoria. But Peter did ask me to first tell you a little bit about myself. So this is me during my PhD. I'm a New Zealander, which explains the accent, although it is a little bit of a strange accent these days, having lived here for 10 years. This is my study site in the northern part of New Zealand, and I'm holding a radio aerial. So I was radio tracking kiwi for my PhD and studying their foraging ecology. So kiwi are a nocturnal bird. They only come out at night. So this was a very beautiful, glorious morning after a long night of hard field work, which is probably why I'm looking decidedly unimpressed in the photograph there. So these are the beautiful birds that I was working with. This very cute little guy is just a very small kiwi chick, and that is the radio transmitter on his leg there that you can see. But actually, although many people have the idea that kiwi are these sweet little things that are about this big, in fact, that's tiny. That is a new hatchling, and when they grow up, they look more like this. So here's a big monster adult kiwi there, and in fact, that is a male bird that my PhD supervisor is holding. The females are even bigger than that one. So the main issue with kiwi, as you might be able to see, is those dinosaurian claws there. That's what you have to watch out for when you're working with these birds. And the biggest challenge of fieldwork with kiwi is keeping yourself warm during the very cold, rainy winter nights in the New Zealand bush. So when I was offered the postdoc here at UCT to go and work in the Kalahari, heading into this kind of environment instead was quite the shock to the system, as was starting work with birds like this instead of birds like kiwi. In this scenario, we have a tiny little innocuous-looking passerine with an incredibly scary beak, and it's the beak end you have to watch out for when you work with a fiscal shrike. Okay, so that's my background. As Peter explained to you, when Phil Hockey sadly passed away in 2013, I was left with the responsibility to bring through his graduate students to complete their degrees. And at the completion of that, UCT, for some reason best known to themselves, offered me a job. So I'm very lucky and privileged to be here speaking with you today. All right, so let me talk to you about the Hotbirds Research Project. It's been running since 2009. It is an international collaboration. The gentleman here is Phil Hockey. I'm sure that many of you will recognize him. And this disreputable-looking guy in the hat here is my close colleague and friend, Andrew McKechnie, who works at the University of Pretoria. So he is my major collaborator on this team effort that we run together. We are now collaborating with the University of Western Australia and the University of Mexico, and increasingly also with the Australian National University and University of Melbourne. So we're really growing rapidly at the moment. So we focus our research on the deserts of South Africa, Australia, and the southern USA. And our aim is to understand the mechanisms that link changes in climates to changes in the range and abundance of birds. So it's one thing to map the temperatures globally and then map where we find birds. It's another thing to understand why they are constrained to the climate envelopes that they exist within. And our mission is to understand those links so that we can better predict what's going to happen as the climate changes. We work in arid zones specifically, well, firstly because, as Peter explained, Phil was a great fan of the Kalahari, but really because arid zones are particularly extreme places to live, and many desert organisms exist at their physiological tolerance limits in deserts. Desert organisms therefore may help us to understand what life can actually cope with at the hot end, and what sort of problems we might start to see animals and birds run into as temperatures continue to rise under climate change. And desert areas particularly are warming rapidly at a greater rate than many other habitats on Earth, with the exception perhaps of polar regions. So here are a few data sets from weather stations around the world, just to show you what that warming trend looks like at the moment. So this graph here is from Yuma, Arizona, which is in the Sonoran Deserts in the southwestern corner of the USA. The x-axis has a year on it. This one starts at about 1980 and finishes at about 2010. And your y-axis is the number of days in which air temperature exceeds 40 degrees Celsius. So you can see that there is scatter around that line there, but we have got this ongoing upward trend. And if we added another 10 years of data to that, you would see that that trend is actually increasing in rate. Okay, so that's Yuma. Here are a couple of weather stations from outback Australia. These ones started a little earlier in the 1950s, Curtin Springs and Birdsville in Queensland. And again, you see that consistent upward trend. And here in South Africa, if we look at Uppington Weather Station and Van Fieksvlei, again, we see that trend. So it's very consistent across the globe. Which means that climate change, the inconvenient truth, is inconveniently true. And hopefully I'm preaching to the converted in this lecture theatre, but sometimes there are people who are unsure about this, because the immense effort that has gone into propaganda to make us doubt this has been very successful. But unfortunately, climate change is real. And for me, it was seeing those weather station graphs that made me realize, hold on, this is actually going on, back in 2008 when I first saw some of those data. So climate change is driven by global warming. These two terms are often used interchangeably. Global warming is the process that's driving the change in climate that we are seeing today. And climate change is anthropogenic in origin, so don't let anyone try to fool you about that either. What we're seeing happening now is because of us. And largely it's because of the burning of fossil fuels. We know this for so many different reasons. There are multiple lines of evidence that tell us that this is the case. But this is one that I find particularly convincing. There is atmospheric evidence that the climate change that we are seeing today is related to us. It's to do with the increase in CO2 levels. Everybody knows about this, right? So here is Mauna Loa in Hawaii, where we have a reader that is logging atmospheric CO2, has been doing so since the 1960s. And so this curve here, famous Keeling curve, shows you how much CO2 is in the atmosphere as we move through time. These sawtooth up and downs on it, that's really fascinating. That shows you the breathing of the boreal forest. So when the CO2 goes down, it's summer in the northern hemisphere, and all of those pine trees in the boreal parts of the world are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. When it starts to go up again, it's winter, and they're releasing CO2, and they're not dragging that CO2 out of the air anymore. So what you see in here, in these little sawtooths, is the power of the natural world to help us combat climate change. But what you also see here is the amounts of CO2 we are putting into the atmosphere is enormously overwhelming that little up and down that the trees are doing for us. And if we look at that carbon, if we actually take a sample of the atmosphere and assess the isotopes of carbon that are in there, we see that what has been happening as the CO2 goes up is that the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere is changing. And it's moving from what it used to be towards a signature that matches what we see if we look at those carbon ratios in fossil fuels. So that's a pretty good piece of evidence that tells us where that extra CO2 is coming from. Okay, so this is a little graphic that I find really nice for illustrating what is happening to temperature through the years. You've got a year in the middle, and that line that's zooming round and round tells you the global temperature, average temperature of the month of the year. And you can see it going up and up towards 2016 there. Okay. All right, so enough about the atmosphere. We know we've got climate change happening. the question now for me, the question now for us in the Hotbirds Research Project is, what is that rising temperature likely to do to the population persistence of our birds? And we think that the relationship between temperature rise and bird populations is going to look something like this. Okay, so here we're trying to hypothesize the mechanisms that might drive change in population persistence as temperature goes up. And we know that we've got temperature effects on physiology. We know we've got temperature effects on behaviour of animals. And those effects should interact to affect survival and reproduction, which in the end is the driver of population persistence. So what I'll tell you about next is what we've been doing in the last 10 years to try to put some numbers and some actual data onto that figure there. And our question is by what mechanisms are birds vulnerable or alternatively resilient to climate change? And by understanding these, we hope that we can understand which species are likely to be most at risk, and then perhaps what we can do about that as well. Okay. All right, so for the next little section of the talk, I'm going to talk to you about physiology, avian physiology, and how that responds to temperature. So because this is summer school, what we're going to do is we're going to do Physiology 101. Okay, so hope you're all prepared for this. So the first thing to note is that thermal environments in arid zones, they really are harsh. If you think about the Kalahari, air temperatures during summer on a hot day can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, but during winter at night, they can be lower than -10. So if you were a little bird like a sociable weaver in the Kalahari Desert, somehow or other, in the face of those extremes, you have to maintain a safe, stable body temperature. Okay, and that is key to your survival. So one of the first things that we did in the Hotbirds research program was try to understand how are birds maintaining a safe body temperature and what are the limits to that. Okay, so this graph here is 3 days worth of temperature trace, body temperature, of this individual, green, aluminium, blue, this sociable weaver here. Okay, so you can see that on the 2nd of February, the 10th of February in 2014, he woke up in the morning, his body temperature went up, and then in the evening he went to sleep, his body temperature dropped again. And the next day, and the next day. We all do this, all endotherms do this, so you do this as well. Right now your body temperature is quite warm, it's probably around 37 degrees. When you go to bed tonight, it'll drop down a little bit when you go to sleep. So these cycles are normal, that's what we expect. Okay, but the other thing that is really interesting to note about green, aluminium, blue's body temperature is that during the day, he likes to maintain it at around 42 to 43 degrees Celsius. You can see that, right? He's not letting it drop much below 40.5. He's definitely not letting it go above about 43.5. But there is quite a bit of variation within that band of temperatures. And it's more than you would see if this was a human. So birds do let their body temperature go up and down a bit more than we do. And what's going to be happening here is that he'll be sitting in a nice shady space and that point there, and then maybe he flew across somewhere to grab something to eat, and that flight raised his body temperature a little bit, and then he let it drop down again. So the question then is, how do birds do it? How do they keep their body temperatures in this nice narrow band, given that they're experiencing air temperatures maybe up to 40 degrees, which is getting close to body temperature? So this is where we get into Thermal Physiology 101, and I'm going to talk you through this, and it will be fine, I promise you. Okay, so your x-axis here is your air temperature, or your environmental temperature. So in this room, the temperature that we're dealing with will be somewhere in the 20s, and most of us are feeling fairly comfortable, I think. Okay. The y-axis is the metabolism, the metabolic rate. So this is how much energy our bird is burning to maintain a nice, stable body temperature. Okay. The thing to notice here is that when it's very cold, our bird is burning a lot of energy to stay warm. As the temperature warms up, the bird needs to spend less and less energy to maintain a stable body temperature. And that's because it's losing less heat to the environment. That makes sense, right? Hopefully. Okay, so if you're a hot thing in a cold place, you're going to tend to lose heat to the environment. If you're a cold thing in a hot place, you're going to pick up heat from the environment. Okay. All right, so as it warms up, the bird needs to spend less energy to stay warm until we get to a range of temperatures here where metabolic rate is minimized, and it's actually very easy to stay stable in your body temperature. But then something very strange happens when it starts to get really hot, and that's that our bird is spending more energy again to remain cool. And this is very counterintuitive because burning energy creates heat. So here we've got a bird that's struggling to maintain a cool, stable body temperature and burning energy and creating heat in order to do so. So what is going on there? Well, this seems to be related to evaporative cooling. Here we go. All right. So at this end, when air temperature starts to exceed body temperature, the only way that you can cool down, actually, is to evaporate water. There's no gradient anymore from the temperature of your body to the temperature of the environment. So there's no way that heat can just dissipate out of you naturally. And in fact, you might be getting into a situation where heat is starting to try and come into your body. So the only way to fight that is to evaporate water, because that takes a whole lot of energy with it when it goes. All right, so at the hot end, birds start to burn water. And this curve here shows you the rate at which they're evaporating water from their bodies. And what is happening at this strange hot end is that to do this, to evaporate water, can require you to put in some effort. So birds don't have sweat glands, so many of them pant the way your dog might at home. And panting causes the chest cavity to have to move in and out, and that causes energy to be burned, and that's why your metabolism goes up at the hot end. So your ability to maintain stable body temperature under extreme hot conditions is all about how well you can evaporate water while fighting this increase in metabolic rate. The more you can evaporate for the least energy, the better off you're going to be. Are you with me still? Hooray! Okay, well done. You made it through Thermal Physiology 101. Okay, so here are a couple of examples from the real world. This is a sand grouse, and this is what is happening to its metabolic rate as air temperature increases. This is a verdin, which is a little species that one of our collaborators in the States works with. And this is what is happening to its evaporative water loss rate as air temperature increases. So you can see that these things do occur in the real world. It's not just a pretty graph. So why would you not just let body temperature rise, given that you have to put all this effort physiologically into keeping it stable? The reason for that is that your body temperature is really strongly linked to your performance. And in this case, by performance, we just mean how well you can do stuff. Anything, really. How well you can breathe, how well you can digest, how well you can run, how well you can fly. All of those things are linked tightly to your body temperature in this very asymmetrical and non-linear way. Okay, so this curve here shows you how well you can do stuff at different body temperatures. If you are a bird, your best performance, so your best ability to live, breathe, reproduce, fly, run away from predators, that is going to happen at body temperatures around 40 degrees Celsius. So most birds are operating in that sort of range. There is a range of tolerable body temperatures at which you can do stuff pretty well, and that's the range that our little sociable weaver was keeping his body temperature in that graph that I showed you earlier. Okay. One thing that's important to notice about this graph is that the decline in performance when body temperature goes outside of that optimum range is steeper at the hot end. Okay, so when your body gets too hot, your proteins start to denature, your cell membranes start to fall apart, and that change can be irreversible. So you don't want to let your body temperature get too hot because you might fall off the thermal cliff. And when you fall off the thermal cliff, the results are not pretty. Okay, so here we have Carnaby's black cockatoos from a mass mortality event that occurred near Perth in 2010 in the grip of an extreme heat wave. And here, this is from a similar heat wave event in the outback of Australia. Those are not leaves on the ground, those are budgies. Okay. So don't fall off the thermal cliff. That is the moral of the story. And if we start seeing scenarios where we get extreme heat waves more and more often, we might start to see this sort of thing occurring more and more often as well. All right, so Andrew's team for the past 10 years have been working hard on understanding these thermal physiological relationships in birds with a view to trying to predict which species can best take the heat. So they have been looking at birds around the world. They've now investigated over 40 species of birds and counting. And they're looking for patterns that can help us to predict vulnerability among species. They've been publishing these in a series of articles called Avian Thermoregulation in the Heat. So if you're interested in getting into the technical nitty-gritty of this stuff, this is where to go. Just Google avian thermoregulation in the heat and Andrew's papers will come up. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of the work that he's done. I'm obviously not going to go through all 40 plus species, but let's just have a quick look at 3 of them. This slide here is to show you how this work is done. Here we have a lovely little owl from the Sonoran Desert. He's sitting inside a little temperature-controlled chamber, which is actually made out of a cool box. And in that chamber, we can control the air temperature very precisely. We're pumping air in the one side and taking it out the other. And if we measure the gas going in and compare it to the gas going out through a whole bunch of very fancy calculations, we can work out how much they've metabolized and how much water they've evaporated. And here is a couple of Andrew's students on the job there. So this takes a few hours. We catch a bird, put it through, release it again, and they're fine. Promise you they're fine. We've done hundreds of birds from 40 species, no dramas. Okay, so what does Andrew's data tell us about? And can we figure out from these data who's the most chilled bird in the world? So let's start with the sociable weaver. So sociable weavers are a passerine bird. They're a songbird. That means that the only way they can evaporate water is by panting. That's their method. And this is what their evaporative water loss curve looks like. As air temperature increases, they start to pump out water at temperatures above about 45 degrees. Here we have a Namakwa dove. So this is our representative of the columbids. And doves are fantastically excellent birds, really. I have grown to really respect them. They can evaporate water through their skin, as well as using a gula flutter mechanism where they vibrate the floor of the throat, and that helps them evaporate water from the mouth as well. And here is our Namakwa dove's evaporative water loss curve. And then we have nightjars, who are probably the kings of the gula flutter because their mouth looks like this. So what a nightjar does when it's hot is it opens that beak and it vibrates the whole floor of that huge area there and evaporates water from that surface. And it can do that by fluttering the throat at a resonant frequency, so it's not using much energy. That's its evaporative water loss curve there. If we overlay our metabolic heat production for our sociable weaver, we can see that at about 48 degrees, we've got a gap like this between the heat being produced and the water being evaporated. So just keep that in your mind's eye, that gap there. That's telling us about your efficiency of evaporative cooling. Okay, so by doing this job, our sociable weaver at 48 degrees can dissipate greater than 200% of the metabolic heat it's producing by evaporating water. And that means that that bird can tolerate air temperatures up to 52 degrees. So that's pretty good going. I was impressed. And then we look at our Namakwa dove. Now this is our Namakwa dove's metabolic rate as temperature rises. And you'll notice something amazing going on here. And that's that it doesn't really increase at the hot ends. So this was a surprise and a shock when we first found this. And this is to do with that really efficient evaporating of water across the skin. And if you look at the gap between these two curves at 48, you can see that it's bigger than that one, right? And the Namakwa doves dissipate an exceptional 450% of the metabolic heat that they produce at 48 degrees by evaporating water across the skin. And this means that they can tolerate air temperatures up to 60. So when you're next on a safari in the Kalahari and you're sitting beside a waterhole in the middle of the day, if you're ever crazy enough to do so, you'll find that the Namakwa doves are there as well, because they can also tolerate that extreme heat. They have a built-in air conditioner across their skin, which is operating probably more efficiently than the one in your car. All right, and then the nightjars. So when we got this one, this was a world record when we first measured that. We were all extremely excited. But then, less than 6 months later, Andrew hired a PhD student who went out to work with nightjars, and he discovered this. So, nightjars have the biggest gap of all here at 48 degrees between the heat they're producing and the heat they're dissipating. And they're managing to dissipate over 500% of their metabolic heat production when the air temperature's at 48, which is allowing them to survive temperatures greater than 60 degrees. And in fact, we don't know how high they can go. We didn't get ethics clearance to push them any higher than that. All right. So who is the most chilled bird in the world? Well, it certainly isn't a songbird. So our passerines in general struggle with high temperatures because they are constrained by that panting mechanism for evaporating water, which means that they're producing a lot of heat while they're trying to lose heat. And if we look across a large number of species, so if we take all of the species that Andrew has studied so far, we see that the evaporative cooling efficiency of passerines is always lower than doves. And this correlates to their ability to tolerate the heat. So passerines always getting to lower temperatures than doves before they give up. All right. So are they the most chilled? Well, who are the most chilled birds in the world? We don't know for sure because we haven't tested everything, but we know for sure that it is not the songbirds, not the passerines. So does that mean it's better to be a dove than a passerine as the world heats up? What do you think? Yeah, maybe, perhaps. But, and here's where my part of the work actually comes in. The relationship between the climate and the physiology of the birds is mediated by their behavior. So all of these data that we've been looking at come from metabolic chambers where the birds are in a lab and they're not able to use the behavioral mechanisms they would normally use to keep cool. And this is important because if you are outside in the Kalahari on a hot day, this is what we see with our eyes. But if we look at the landscape with a thermal imaging camera, we can see that 38 degrees air temperature doesn't translate to a uniform 38 degrees across the environment. So there are pockets of cool air trapped within those trees there where you see the blue and green, and the ground is getting up above 50 degrees Celsius where you can see the white and red there. So you can use the landscape to help you keep cool. And this is because if you're out there in the wild, the temperature you experience is not the air temperature, actually. It's some sort of combination of the air temperature and the wind speed and the solar radiation that's falling on you, the humidity you're experiencing, and the radiation reflected from the ground and surfaces around you. So the temperature you feel is never the same as the temperature that the weather forecaster tells you that it is. Okay. And the moral of the story here is that if you are sitting somewhere nice and shaded and in the wind, you're going to be feeling a lot cooler than if you're out here in the open on the ground, for example, even on a day that's the same air temperature. So with Rowan, one of the first things we do was set out to measure the differences in temperature across the environment in the Kalahari that our birds were dealing with. And here's just an example from midday during summer where air temperature was 37 degrees. We have a range of temperatures greater than 20 degrees difference across this landscape. 65 down here on the ground in the sun, 41 up there in the shade in the tree. So shade-seeking behavior can enormously reduce the heat load that your birds are experiencing in the wild. And that means that birds have a whole range of behavioral strategies for keeping cool. So here are the three main ones that we mostly think about. We've got air temperature on the x-axis, and we've got the amount of time or the probability that the birds are doing this on the y-axis. And again, this is real data from our friends, green, aluminium, blue. So you can see that as air temperature increased, our sociable weaver was heading into the shade more and more, as you would expect. As air temperature increased, he stopped doing things. He was dropping his activity, it reduced his metabolic rate, but he's also being constrained into those shaded places in the environment. And you can see, of course, that his evaporative water loss is increasing, and we can actually see that visibly by looking at the bird with a pair of binoculars, because you can see that he has started panting. However, behavioral strategies that you might use for keeping cool potentially also carry costs. The obvious one with panting is that it leads to dehydration if you're unable to obtain water. But all three of these can lead to missed opportunities. And that's an interesting thing, because these are very easy to overlook. You're out there in the sun, you go stand in the shade under a tree, you don't really think that that carries a cost. It's so easy to do. But it means that you can't actually go and get an ice cream from the shop because you're stuck under the tree. Okay, so if you're a bird, this becomes serious. All right, so we have been studying the costs and consequences of behavioural thermoregulation in birds for the last 10 years in the Kalahari as well. Also in the Fynbos biome, these are the birds that we've worked with so far. This is a lot harder than putting a bird in a respirometry chamber and measuring its physiology. This requires PhDs and master's projects that go on for years. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a bit about these three here, starting with my own study species, the fiscal shrike there. All right, so what do fiscal shrikes do? We know that they are a hunting bird that likes to sit high on perches. You're all familiar with this species? Yes. Okay, so they like to sit up on a branch and look at the ground, and then they like to pounce down and annihilate things like crickets and field mice and other small birds. And then they grab them and hang them on a branch somewhere and pull them to pieces. We're all aware of this delightful behaviour. But what this means for a fiscal shrike is that it needs to be sitting somewhere high and in the sun in order to hunt effectively. Okay, so this little plot here shows you the preference that these birds have for different types of perches in the environment. On the left, we have shade perches that are lower than my eye level, or H for higher than my eye level. On the right, perches in the sun that are lower or higher than my eye level. High-tech stuff, this. And as we can see on the y-axis, you've got preference. That's an index that we calculate. If you look at the 0 line, everything above that 0 is preferred, everything below is avoided. So under normal circumstances in the blue, these birds are preferring those high sunny perches. But on hot afternoons, they shift that preference to high shaded perches in the orange, which is allowing them to save 4 degrees of heat load if you measure the environmental temperature in those locations, which is a big deal. If you think about those curves that we looked at previously, 4 degrees could shift you from not having to evaporate any water at all to having to evaporate a whole lot. Okay, so that's why they do it, but they do pay a cost, and that cost is in their hunting efficiency. So as soon as they move into the shade, their prey capture rates drop by about half, and this is probably because those shaded perches are necessarily surrounded by vegetation, so they cannot see as well to hunt anymore. I was studying breeding birds during my postdoc, and what I found was that this shift into the shade that resulted in this loss of prey capture, prey hunting success, also translated to a change in the number of provisions, so the number of bits of food that they were able to take to the nest for their chicks. So you can see here on cool days that their provisions per hour are much higher than they are on hot days. And by hot days, I mean days above 35. So that's a bit of an arbitrary division for the purposes of showing you these data. Okay, and this actually matters. So here we have a little clutch of 6-day-old fiscal shrike chicks looking adorably cute, I'm sure you will agree. Maybe not. And this is the daily air temperature maximum on the x-axis and the amounts by which these chicks were growing on the y-axis, so their percent body mass gain. So on a cool day, a 6-day-old fiscal shrike will put on about 50% of its body mass again. Okay, so if you can imagine that happening with your own child or yourself, you'll get an idea of just how big a deal this is. Right, so they're growing very, very fast at this age. But as air temperature goes up towards 40 degrees, they're only managing to put on about 10% of their body mass in a day. They need to grow. They are tiny little chicks, and they are trying to turn into big, fierce shrikes, so they need to be growing. And this kind of scenario is extremely bad for them in terms of making it out of the nest as an adult bird. So we can actually look at the consequences of hot days for their body size when they fledge the nest. And these graphs show you something to do with that. Okay, so I'll talk you through them because they're a little bit complicated. The left one is body mass, the right one is fledging date, so how many days it took them to actually get out of the nest. If we look at this data point here, what this is telling us is that for a single day that exceeded 35 degrees during the entire nesting period of that shrike, it was fledging half a day later. It doesn't sound too dramatic, but you can see that as it gets hotter, that delay in fledging gets longer. The same scenario is happening in the body mass graph. As it gets hotter, the weight at which they're fledging is getting lower. So these birds are fledging small, they're fledging light, and they're fledging late. And that's a major risk because each additional day in the nest in the Kalahari carries a 4% increase in predation risk. So the longer it takes you to get out, the less likely you are to actually get out at all. The smaller you fledge, the less likely you are to make it through the cold winter to the next breeding season. So these are problems. So for a fiscal shrike, shade seeking leads to loss of foraging, which leads to lower breeding success. We see similar scenario if we look at southern yellow-billed hornbills. This is my PhD student Tanya and her study species there. For the hornbills, we looked at the amount of time they spend panting as air temperature increases, and as you would expect, it goes up. And we also looked at what they do when it gets hot, and as you might expect, they shift up from their preferred foraging sites under the ground into the shade of the trees. Those changes also carry costs. For a hornbill, if you are panting, you have to use your beak and hold it open to evaporate water. That means it's really hard to pick things up and break them into pieces and eat them. So we actually see a trade-off between panting and foraging, actually being able to handle prey, which means that their prey capture rates per hour when they're panting are much lower than they are when they're not. We also see that their foraging success is much lower in those shaded locations and trees than it is on the ground. And these translate to a lower foraging success as temperature rises. Again, we're working with breeding birds, and their provisioning rate drops as well with the hot temperatures, and so does their body mass. So the nice thing we were able to do with the hornbills is put a little perch scale on the nest box and weigh those birds as they came in, and you can see that they're actually starting to lose weight, the adults themselves, on the hot days because of this lost ability to forage. So 36.5 degrees, they can no longer break even. So in this case, again, we've got changes in behaviour for thermoregulation leading to loss of foraging, leading to loss of provisioning, leading to loss of breeding success. Here's your probability of fledging a chick as temperature increases, and here's the size of that chick when it fledges as temperature increases. So if you have a hot nesting period, you're fledging again small, light, late, less likely to come out at all. Okay, so our thresholds here, 35 degrees Celsius. Above that temperature, your birds are not fledging anymore. Okay. So a nifty thing that Tanya did, she took this an extra step, and she was able to actually partition statistically how much of that loss in nest success could be attributed to that loss of provisioning rates by the parents, and how much that we could attribute to just the chicks themselves getting too hot in their nests. So this is a path diagram which shows you that. And Tanya was able to show that about 30% of the temperature cost for hornbills is via that loss of provisioning, and about 70% is via the chicks themselves just getting too hot in the nest. This is important because if we can partition the effects like this, we can know where to put our conservation effort. Okay, if it's too hot in the nest, maybe we can insulate the nest. If the parents aren't provisioning enough, maybe we can provide extra food into that environment. It gives us answers, which is great. So this compromised foraging is a consistent pattern across species. The critical temperatures at which it really starts to kick in tend to be the mid-30s. We see loss of body mass in many of our species at about 35, 36 degrees. And we see compromised breeding success, again, in the mid-30s. All right, so the last bird I want to tell you about is the fork-tailed drongo, which is the Kalahari superstar and a little bit of a surprise to us all. So what you may have been thinking, potentially, if you're still awake and on the ball while I was going through those, is that, well, she's talking about how their foraging success goes down when it gets hot, and she keeps telling us that it's trade-offs with what they're doing to thermoregulate. But what if it's just that the insects and the prey are all going and hiding away? So we did think about this. And we tried an experiment with fork-tailed drongos to untangle these effects. Is it behavioural trade-offs with thermoregulation, or is it just changing prey availability? So this is Tom Flower, my colleague at the top here, with one of his trained fork-tailed drongos sitting on his finger. So Tom has a population of drongos in the Kalahari, which he has habituated, trained, to come and do experiments with him. So he can whistle, they come to him, and then we can do things with them. It's really fantastic. And here is my and Tom's student Ryan here with one of these fabulous birds. So what we did is we called drongos over and we pinged mealworms to them, and we looked at how many of those mealworms they would actually fly for as temperature rose. And then what they did with them. Did they take them to the nest, or did they eat them themselves? And this allowed us to disentangle that availability of prey from the temperature. So we keep the prey constant, then we know any effects we see are actually due to the temperature. Okay, so here is our field assistant flinging a worm to a drongo. They're fantastic. They sit on a perch, you ping them a worm, they come get it, they go back, they wait for you, you ping them another one, superb. So this is what we found. As temperature increases, our birds would increasingly look at you as you threw a worm, raise an eyebrow, and turn their back. Okay. So the hotter it gets, the more often they refuse to actually fly for a prey item that is easily available right there in front of them. This occurs whether they're breeding or whether they're not, although they'll try a bit harder in the heat if they have nestlings to feed. So birds begin refusing to fly as temperature increases, which tells us that thermoregulatory costs directly influence foraging. It's not just about prey availability. If we look at their decision making with the prey that they catch, we see that as temperature goes up, they get increasingly selfish. They're more and more likely to eat that mealworm themselves, less and less likely to fly to the nest and give it to the chick. So this suggests that your birds are paying a thermoregulatory cost, which is directly influencing the provisioning of chicks. The hotter it gets, the more they're evaporating water. Drongos don't normally drink, so the water they're getting is coming out of the food. So what's happening here is that they are keeping that mealworm for themselves in order that they have enough water to evaporate, in order that they can keep their body temperature safe. It's a critical survival thing. It's also really hard to fly away to a nest when it's really hot, because again, you're adding temperature into your system by taking flight. So that's what's going on there. So based on these results and what we saw with the other species, what do you think is happening to the chicks of the drongos as temperature rises? Losing weight, getting smaller, suffering, failing to fledge. Yeah, we thought so too, and we went and measured it, and that's what we found. So that's your temperature during the nesting period and your fledging mass on the y-axis. So somehow or other, drongos are paying all of these costs and changing their behaviour and buffering their chicks from it. Somehow. And we have no idea how. Okay, so that's why I say drongos are the Kalahari superstar. You could also call them a Darwinian demon. They're a species that seems to be escaping the selection pressure that's affecting everybody else. And we don't know how. It's really quite exciting. So we have a PhD student working on this problem now. Okay, so to conclude, birds have built-in mechanisms that they can use to cope with the heat. They have a more flexible body temperature than we do, so they allow their body temperature to go up and down a little bit more than we do, which gives them a bit more room to move. They avoid falling off the thermal cliff through having quite low metabolic rates, especially in deserts. So you saw those low curves on the 3 birds that I showed you. And they have extremely efficient evaporative cooling mechanisms, especially if they are a dove or a nightjar, less so if they're a passerine songbird. And they can use the landscape and alter their activity patterns to keep cool. But none of these things come for free. Okay, so allowing your body temperature to rise and fall the way birds do means that their performance is never quite optimized to the same extent that it could be if they kept it completely stable. So at the tame ends, allowing a bit of hypothermia there risks lowering your performance. And then even your very efficient evaporative coolers, like your doves and your nightjars, potentially face immense challenges in terms of water balance, especially in deserts. So we think that birds like Cape turtle doves are anchored into the Kalahari by all of that artificial water that we're providing. As climate changes and the temperature rises, if they don't have access to that water, it doesn't matter how efficient they are at using evaporative cooling, because there's no water available for them to use. So doves are water-powered, and that is what limits them in the desert. And then we have all these behavioural adjustments that you can use to keep yourself cool in a hot landscape. But they have the potential to reduce your survival and your breeding success over the long term, as we still saw in all of those species that I showed you, except for that drongo, which is somehow escaping this trap. Okay, so desert birds are living life in a fine balance, and climate change is tipping this up. The hotter it gets, the more they are going to be pushed past these thresholds and these thermal limits. So what can we do about this? Well, in our research, we are trying to find threads that we can pull on to allow us to mitigate some of these effects in the background of rising temperatures that don't seem to be going away. So one key thread is to understand how some of these species might manage to escape the thermal trap, like the drongos, if indeed they actually do. Because if we know how they're doing it, that might allow us to put in place methods that allow other species to do the same. So we have a PhD student working on the drongos now. Here he is, Ben Murphy in the field, trying to understand what the drongos are doing to buffer those chicks and whether there's a cost being paid somewhere else in the system that we don't know about. Okay. By using these fancy statistics to partition the mechanisms by which high temperatures are causing nest failure, we can also understand where in that system to put in mitigatory methods. So in this case, we have the path model from the yellow-billed hornbills showing that the temperature effect on nest success was driven mostly by nest temperatures and the impact that had on the physiology of the chicks, but driven in part by provisioning rate. So in a system with yellow-billed hornbills, we would probably focus our attention here and try to provide those birds with better nest sites. Yellow-billed hornbills are quite widespread, but this guy, southern ground hornbill, is an endangered species, and we have a project starting now trying to build a model like this for this species, so we can actually put in place some active conservation intervention to help those birds in a warming world. And then the thresholds that are coming out of these data, the tipping points that we were seeing in those graphs, temperatures above which nests start to fail, temperatures above which adults start to lose weight. We can map those in space and time using climate change projection models, and that helps us too. So here is a model of temperature now and in 2080 across southern Africa, and those colours there are telling you the summer average maximum temperature. Where it's grey are areas above that 35-degree threshold where yellow-billed hornbill nests start to fail. So we can see that there are areas of southern Africa that are simply not going to be suitable for this species in 80 years' time, 70 years' time now, 60 years' time, sure. But we can also see that there are areas in the lighter shading which might become thermal refuges for some of our birds. So for the hornbill, this area here in the southern part of its range, so the range is this hashed area there, here where we have Kruger Park, and this area here around towards Gauteng, those areas are not going to be exceeding the tolerance thresholds for hornbills in 60 years' time. It will still be cool enough there. So those are the areas where we should be thinking about putting our conservation efforts for that species. Everywhere else we might just lose the fight, but there we might have a chance. Okay, and what about us? What can we do ourselves? So this is where I get political. It's not often as a scientist that you get to get political, but now is the time. What can we do about this climate change problem? It's a tough one because it requires us to really reevaluate how we live. But I think that the rule of thumb is that less is more. So the single biggest thing that any of us can do is to think about our consumption, reduce what we buy, reduce what we use, and think about efficiency in everything that we do. It's actually quite easy once you get into the mindset. We all know how easy it is to save water once you realize you have to. So if you think about just saving kilometers on your car, you don't need to sell it, just think about driving it less. Think about sharing your lift with somebody else. Think about when you go to Woolworths trying to find something that's not in a plastic packet. These are the sorts of things we can do, and they're small, but collectively they will make a difference, and it's worth bearing that in mind and holding on to that hope. But the other thing that we can do is use our voices for change. And this can be powerful. You've seen what the students have been achieving around the world recently. You've seen Greta with her braids staring down Trump, which is rather a wonderful image. But using our voices for change is one of the most powerful things that we can do. You don't have to get into Extinction Rebellion and get yourself arrested. You could just simply start by talking to your friends and saying, hey, why don't we ride share? This climate change thing is real. There are little things that we can do. Let's do it together. That could be one way forward. So let's try. I mean, those of us who are keen to get ourselves thrown in jail, that's one way forward. But those of us who aren't, there are things that we can do, and we should. All right, so that's the end of my politics, and thank you very much. It's also the end of my talk. So any questions you have, I'd be very happy to take. Thank you. Yes?
I see Europe here already a little bit, the range moving. Birds that you saw only in France, you now slowly start seeing in Belgium and Netherlands.
Yes.
Wouldn't you see the same with the last picture that you did about where to focus the conservation efforts?
Yes, that's right.
Could it also be that we're going to see yellow-billed hornbills in Cape Town in 50 years?
Maybe. So yes, range shifts are a part of how birds are responding to climate change, and we are seeing that enormously already. In Europe, as you say, also here in Southern Africa. They're quite hard to disentangle from shifts that are to do with land use change, but they are happening. Pied crows are a really good example of this. So we know that there are a lot more pied crows in the southwest part of the country than there used to be. And it's generally blamed on roads and power lines, right? And that is part of what's happening. But we did an analysis of this, and we found that pied crows are following a climate bubble, so a bubble of suitable temperature for them, down into the Karoo. They actually like an average annual temperature of 19 degrees. There's a trivia fact for you. And so they will follow that average annual temperature, and it's warming in the Karoo, and it's now 19 degrees on average there, which is why we have so many pied crows in that area. But they are using the power lines as stepping stones to get there. So pied crows require a structure to nest on. There aren't any trees in the Karoo, so they're following the power lines instead. So we get these remarkable synergies between changing climates and the things that we are doing to the land, changing land use, allowing birds to either move like the pied crow, or in other cases not move. So the issue with yellow-billed hornbills is that they also need trees, old trees with cavities to nest in. So even if the climate becomes suitable down here, they need to somehow get here across the Karoo, and those barriers to movement are potentially a part of the problem. There's a huge field of research on this and what we can do about it, and whether we should be picking species up and moving them across those barriers and putting them in new places or not, and there's all sorts of debate about that. But certainly the change in ranges is going to be a big thing, and whether or not there's suitable receiving habitats and whether or not they're actually physically capable of getting there are what are going to constrain that. I hope that answers your question. Anyone else? I'm going to get off really lightly. Oh, hello.
A while ago, I took some photographs of pintail whiners spread out on a hot gravel path near my house. It was a really interesting event because the females would come down and they would 4 or 5 of them would spread themselves out, and then followed by male and maybe a second male and so forth. They were all panting. It was a very hot day, and so on. Is that recognised as being one of these sort of cooling mechanisms?
Okay, that's a really interesting observation. And actually, it isn't. It's an interesting trade-off that those birds are making. So what they're doing is they're putting themselves in a very hot part of the environment on a very hot day, and you could see that they were suffering for it. So they were panting, and they were working hard to keep their body temperatures stable in that very challenging environment. So why on earth would they do it? So we think what they're actually doing is using those high temperatures and the costs associated to kill the parasites in their feathers. So what the birds are doing is they are taking advantage of their ability to evaporate water and stay alive to absolutely annihilate everything that's chewing on their feathers and biting them to pieces. Okay, so they're taking advantage of their greater thermal tolerance to kill the predators and the parasites in the plumage. But it's a costly thing to do. They were spending a lot of water on it, as you saw. So they have to make a balance between how bad their parasite infestation is and how much they can afford to allow their water reserves to go down and potentially risk a bit of hypothermia. really great observation. What a cool thing to see.
The other thing, if I may, is you haven't mentioned thermal